Welcome back, everyone. As we heard yesterday with our Civilians in the Crossfire session, we want to give a look behind the curtain and occasionally steer away from the X's and O's of operational history and the battles and the personalities. And we wanted, when the committee was together, we wanted to look at what this last 12 months or so of the war meant for those who were held captive, and we have titled the session, The Uncertainty of Surrender, POWs in Captivity. To chair this session is one of the museum's, perhaps the museum's oldest friend, not in age, but in tenure, Dr. Günter Bischof, the former Marshall Plan Professor of History and Director of Center Austria at the University of New Orleans. Günter was one of, or the very first master student that Dr. Stephen Ambrose and Dr. Nick Mueller taught, and they taught him so well he went off to Harvard to get his PhD, and they gave him such fond memories that he came back and took a job working with them, not working for them, at the University of New Orleans. He's one of our original presidential counselors, and he still remains so since 2006, and is a member of our conference planning committee. So, ladies and gentlemen, to chair our session, Dr. Günter Bischof.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, it's so good to be with you. Good afternoon, and also good afternoon to our folks online. Now, I'm not going to do the apology that Peter Schreivers did, our Belgian colleague, and apologize for my foreign accent. I do admit that I'm originally from Austria, and after 40 years of living in the US, I still have an accent. Just don't tell me afterwards it's cute. I know Americans are very generous with people with foreign accents. Now, why POWs, you ask yourselves? And I just wanted to let you know why I'm interested in this topic. There is two main reasons. The first reason is that my own father was a POW in the United States. He was a German Wehrmacht soldier. You know, he was a young man when Hitler took over Austria in 1938, and they didn't have a choice. So he joined the Wehrmacht when he was drafted, and he fought up in Finland for much of the war and was taken a prisoner down in Kaiserslautern at the end of the war and shipped to Colorado Springs, where he was in Camp Carson for an entire year. And the second reason why I'm interested in the topic is this, that I did a book with Stephen Ambrose when I got hired at UNO, Eisenhower and the German POWs. Some of you might remember the Buck Affair. Now, what was the Buck Affair all about? In a way, it was touched upon a bit by Rob Citino on Thursday evening when he talked about the Rhine Meadow camps. Buck was a Canadian writer who said, when he came out with a book called Other Losses, that Other Losses was a categorization in the American documents that meant actually war deaths. Now, I think Buck didn't really realize that the Americans had an impossible job at the end of the war in Germany. The entire army surrendered. If you recall, when the Ruhr Pocket, which we've talked about for a number of times in this conference, when the surrender came in the Ruhr Pocket, the United States got in one day 400,000 POWs. So they had to deal with millions, and in a way it showed they weren't really prepared for millions to take care of. So what they did is they put up cages in the so-called Rhine meadows. These are areas next to the River Rhine in Western Germany after the Allies crossed the Rhine, so they put them close by. And in these Rhine meadows, hundreds of thousands of men lived in open cages, and they didn't get enough food and drink to eat, but we cannot really speak of another Holocaust as Buck did. And I think that's the important point. The Americans were overwhelmed. They didn't treat these German POWs well, but as soon as they had the opportunity to treat them better, they did. And I always said my father was very lucky that he managed to get to the United States because those POWs were treated quite well. And there were some 380,000 Germans here in the United States. So I just wanted to say, for those reasons, I've been advocating in the committee that Jeremy mentioned. We have a committee that every year meets during the time of the conference to prepare next year's program. And I've been advocating for a long time to do something on POW, and finally I succeeded. So we are in a good position here. We have two excellent historians who will tell us about prisoners of war. Rich Frank is going to talk about how the Japanese treated their POWs. And I think in this audience, I don't need to lose many words about Rich Frank. He is a dear friend of the museum. He is the historian on what he calls the Asia-Pacific theater. He's written a great book on Guadalcanal and one on Downfall, the End of the Japanese Empire, and he is now at work on a 3-volume trilogy about the Japanese Empire during World War II, and the first volume is out. And I think I also should mention to this audience that if you see The Road to Tokyo, Rich played a very important role as a historical advisor to the museum in that exhibit. So he took a direct role in making the museum what today it is. Our second speaker today will be Jason Dawsey. Now, Jason used to work for the Jenny Craig Institute. He is a PhD from the University of Chicago, a European intellectual historian. His dissertation was on Günter Anders. You ask yourself, who was Günter Anders? Anders was one of the first and most important critics of technology in the 20th century. He was very critical of the atomic device, too. So he worked on Günter Anders, and we did a book together on Anders. And Jason has taught at various universities. He taught at the University of Southern Mississippi. He taught at the University of Tennessee in Knoxville. He taught at the University of New Orleans, too, as an adjunct professor when he was down here at the museum. And now he is teaching as a professor from a distance at Arizona State University in the World War II program that Arizona State has with the museum here. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Rich Frank.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Günter. Since Rob Citino's sparkling opening remarks, and through yesterday and even this morning, you've heard the name Rich Frank mentioned several times. I am Rich Frank, and I approve those messages. Okay. That's about the last humorous thing we're going to have in this presentation. Oops, what are we doing here? I'm not getting a side flip.
Yeah, it is up there.
Oh, is it back up there? Oh, there we go. First thing I wanted to talk about, I use two very old but very standard American reports to use the numbers for Americans in World War II. One by the Army, which you see there as you look at it on your right, and on the left is the Navy version. Because these cover all the campaigns, all the battles, and are very useful for the purposes of this presentation. Let me start then with a basic overview. Now, these are American casualties in World War II confined only to battle deaths, right? There's about 113,000 other deaths in World War II which were outside of battle deaths in the armed services. You have about 9,000 merchant mariners dying, and you have several thousand civilians dying that we know, although the civilian numbers, I think, are very soft. What I would emphasize about what this shows, first of all, if you look to the far side of the figures, it tells you one thing that's very interesting, which is basically for every American casualty in the Asia-Pacific theater, there were about 6 in the European theater. The second thing I would point out to you is that if you look just next to the total, you'll notice that there is this unaccounted theaters. Even as good as our numbers are of the total number of million battle casualties, about 32,000 the Army and the Navy were not able to actually associate with a specific campaign or battle. But you can tell, obviously, that this is By comparison with most other combatants, as tragic as every individual number is, the United States got through the war with a relatively low total rate of casualties during the war. These are the Army and Army Air Force numbers. Now, back in World War II, we had no Air Force. Some would still say that's a good thing. And you'll see that you have the numbers for both the Atlantic Theater and what I call the Pacific Theater, and then again the undesignated theaters, and you'll see what the numbers are for that. When you look at that, it gives you some perception of just exactly how steep the death total is in the Pacific Theater, and how relatively lightly the POW death total was in the European theater, which of course is one of the reasons that made being a prisoner of the Japanese such a horrific experience during World War II. And I'd like to point out that basically when you're, I'm sorry, I think this skipped over one of my slides. Yeah, Army Air Force. Oh. This is a picture that was taken at the west entrance of the Malinta Tunnel on 6th May 1942 at the Surrender Corregidor. And the reason why I have this up here is if you look at this photograph, for every 10 individuals in this photograph, 4 of them, but statistically, were going to die as a prisoner of the Japanese. And I think this is in some ways more powerful than just giving you the statistics when you actually get to look at the actual individuals. And this is the Navy numbers. The one great fault I find with the Navy Department numbers, of course, the Navy Department includes the United States Marine Corps. Try as I might, both within this report and others, I could not find a solid number for the total number of naval personnel, including the Marines, who became prisoners of the Japanese. So what I do have are the number of deaths of naval personnel during the Japanese captivity. And you'll see here that the numbers in Europe are very small. And then when you put together the numbers for the Pacific Theater and the unaccounted theater, you see that the vast majority of the deaths of American prisoners of war occurred in the Pacific Theater. I'm sorry, and this is the death total again here. It's almost inconceivable to me to think that basically 41%, approaching half of all the American prisoners of war that were taken by the Japanese actually perished in Japanese captivity. But that was the grim reality. I would point out that, of course, I spend a lot of time not only looking at the American experience in the Asia-Pacific War, but also the experience of others. The Australians, their official numbers show that they suffered a total of 17,000 battle deaths fighting the Japanese in the Asia-Pacific War. Of that total, by the Australian count, about 8,000 of those died when they were in the status of a prisoner of war, which is to say almost half of all Australian fatalities during World War II fighting the Japanese were in fact prisoners of war. We have a huge problem with respect to China. We still don't have, I think, what are convincingly solid numbers for the total number of Chinese military personnel who died. The range that's normally given is somewhere between 2 and 4 million total battle deaths or deaths in the Chinese armed forces. I usually use about a 3 million figure. And what's really disturbing is we don't really have what I deem to be good numbers with respect to how many of those Chinese were taken prisoner and how many of those survived. In a book by Herbert Bix about Hirohito and the Pacific War, he gives the startling statement that at the end of the war, when the Japanese were required to turn over all the POW holdings they had, they presented a total of 56 Chinese, which they claimed was their total number of prisoners taken during the entire war. I've had some research done on his sites. I have no doubt whatsoever that Professor Bix had some solid basis for that number. It's just that the citation that he used does not seem to support that number. But I am also equally confident that the number of Chinese who survived being taken prisoner by the Japanese was a very small fraction of the total number of prisoners taken. And that was most conspicuously illustrated at the Battle at Nanjing in the late 1937 into early 1939, where there a mass slaughter of the Chinese POWs that are taken at Nanjing. During the course of the Asia-Pacific War, the Americans, as did, I think, all the other combatants who fought the Japanese, we all know for sure that large numbers of prisoners were taken by the Japanese. And as far as we can tell, there were no records to confirm exactly how many of these there were. We do have scattered records clearly showing that prisoners were taken and then killed. I know, for instance, one example, we captured a diary of a Japanese soldier on Guadalcanal that recited an account where 2 Marines who had been taken prisoner by the Japanese on Guadalcanal were attempted to escape. They were retaken. They were then staked out on the ground, and the medical officer of the Japanese unit proceeded to cut out their livers while they were still alive before they died. The Japanese official history of the Guadalcanal campaign contains a number of references to Americans taken prisoner on the island of Guadalcanal, and none of whom survived captivity. The situation with respect to the Chinese, as I mentioned, I think is a great deal, in fact, worse than this in terms of the total number. And the Chinese were not reciprocated. They were not real keen on taking Japanese prisoners. And this was characteristic of virtually everyone who fought the Japanese during the war. One of the things that becomes very clear if you look not only at the American battles against the Japanese, but if you look at the Australians, the British, the Indians, even the black soldiers that the British Commonwealth brought over from East and West Africa to fight in Burma. They encountered the same enemy that fought under the same set of battle ethics of not taking prisoners or conducting really horrendous torture deaths of prisoners they took. And virtually everyone had exactly the same response to this as did the Americans. So why didn't the Japanese, or why is there a significantly higher death rate among American POWs and civilian internees in the Asia-Pacific conflict? Well, I think the first and most important reason that explains the extraordinarily high death rate just with respect to the Americans is that for American military POWs, most of them were taken in the Philippines and in the Netherlands, East Indies in the first 6 months of the war. And these individuals were almost entirely captured under conditions in which they were very severely physically impaired and also psychologically impaired. Compared to, say, the Australians or the British who were taken prisoner in the Malaya campaigns, the Americans were in a much, much worse physical shape when they entered captivity than those other Western Allied forces. Secondly, the Japanese were never prepared to take that number of prisoners, and that clearly was an aspect of why there was a high death rate. For instance, in Bataan, they captured many, many more Allied, particularly Filipino and American prisoners than they expected at the time. And finally, there's just simply the fact that the Japanese armed forces had eventually evolved by 1941 into a set of dictates with respect to their conduct during the war, which told their combatants quite clearly that to be taken prisoner was the utmost in shame, and they should never be taken prisoner under any circumstances. And the corollary to this was that anyone who would surrender to them, obviously, they regarded as contemptible. There is some literature that's been written that attempts, in my view, to try to explain this away that no, the Japanese really were not motivated by the things I've just talked about, but they simply had administrative problems or difficulties with handling so many POWs. But once again, if you go back and look at the entire sweep of the Japanese records with POWs going back to China in 1937, it seems to me it's quite clear that this was something that was simply endemic in the conduct of the Japanese armed forces during World War II. The other thing that became a tragic feature of prisoner captivity was that when the Allied forces, American forces, Australians, began closing in on Japan, particularly in 1944, the Japanese began attempting to evacuate a lot of POWs from areas that they thought might come under control of the Americans, of the Allies. And they were put on ships, and tragically, these ships were unmarked, and in many instances, they were sunk by usually American submarines and some British submarines. And you'll see the numbers that died on these ships, and the sinkings were quite high, as they lay out here in the slide. We don't have really good numbers with respect to the Australians because there's some mixed groups of British and Australians. The sources that we have available don't clearly segregate the two. Secondly, we have enormous numbers of slave laborers, notably from places like Indonesia, who perished in sinkings during submarines during particularly 1944, during the Japanese attempts to evacuate POWs back to Japan or other areas. The worst single instance of this came in September 1944 when a British submarine, the Tradewind, sank this merchant ship, Maru, and you'll see that this horrendous numbers of both POWs and slave laborers died in this one single incident during World War II. I've given you a lot of statistics, and I want to close out simply to tell you, I want you to just look at the faces of these men and know what fate awaits them, and remember. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Rich, for staying within the time, too. Well within time, so that's good. Jason, you're on.
One more. There we go. Ladies and gentlemen, it is great to be with you today. It's always good to be back with friends and colleagues here at the museum and such a passionate and enthusiastic audience. And I want to just very quickly thank Mike Bell, Jeremy Collins, and Connie Gentry for the opportunity, and to be on a panel with Günter and Rich is just always just an extra, a bonus. So I want to jump right in terms of covering with you. I'm going to do things a little differently than what Rich did, in that I'm going to really focus on the last 6 months of the war in Europe and what happens with American prisoners of war. Then this lead image, I'm actually kind of getting this out of the way, is men of the 14th Armored Division are liberating O-Flag 13B, the site of this is actually first week of April of 1945, and some 10 days or so after the notorious Hammelburg raid. I don't want to get into that very much, as it gets so much attention regarding American prisoners late in the war, General Patton and his son-in-law. If you're really interested in this, I would highly recommend the oral history with Abe Baum leading this raid and what he has to say about it, conducted by the museum. So what I want to do here is kind of have a couple of guiding points I'd like us to think about. And one is that we're now like on the cusp of these major commemorations, the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II, and to think about where POWs should fit in these narratives. You know, where do we include them in this story? How much attention should we get? We're certainly going to get a lot of attention, and rightly so, about the American liberation of the SS-run camps, the concentration camps, the kind of revelations about the Holocaust, other groups targeted for genocide. What we don't want to do is, in the process, lose sight of the fact that prisoners of war are also caught up in these events in the last months of the war, and their stories should be taken very seriously as well. So one point to note here before I kind of explain this map about the German Stalag system is that we're dealing here with dramatically different numbers than what Rich pointed to in the case of American POWs in Japan. And there are very good reasons, actually, for that. And so far as that, the Japanese contempt for surrender, certainly issues about race one can talk about. In the Nazi case, the way French, British, and American POWs are treated versus, say, Soviet POWs, that's been extensively documented. So let me provide some numbers and say something about this map. What are we talking about when we talk about numbers? If you're looking at the entirety of American involvement in the war in Europe regarding German captivity, you're talking about 94,000 or so Americans that are taken prisoner during that period, really 1942 to 1945. There's still some debate about numbers. I'm drawing on some of my own experience working for the Defense POW MIA accounting agency. I'm still very proud of the fact I was the first DPAA fellow here at the museum, and a lot of work done by my former colleague at the museum, Kim Geis. So one number, and I think it's a solid number, that's been proposed is about 1,100 Americans perished in this German POW camp system. That puts around between 1 and 1.5% as a mortality rate. Günter Bischof and Stephen Ambrose, in the book that Günter has in front of him, they talked about 1%. You will sometimes see people push that up to between 2 and 3, but I think in general, you're saying between 1 and 2% of American prisoners in the German system did not survive. So one can say easily 1 is too many. But when we think about, and we have to think about the fact that, according to Christian Streit, a German historian in the late 1970s, he estimated that 57% of Soviet prisoners of war in German captivity perished. That totaled about 3.3 million individuals. So these discrepancies we can't lose sight of, and I'll actually say a little bit about them as we get further along. Now this map, and this is just very quickly showing you a map of the German Stalag system. According to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, they're counting all camps that were maintained by the Nazi regime. You're talking about 30 to 40,000 camps of all sorts. Everything from concentration and extermination camps to ghettos to forced labor sites to POW sites. So one of the inmates in this Nazi system, David Rousset, he was a French leftist, a resistance fighter. He coined this very evocative phrase right after World War II, that the Nazis had a concentrationary universe. It's quite a phrase, and yet it's too narrow to really capture just the full vastness of the system here. And this shows camps in Germany in present-day Austria. Some of these are now in present-day Poland or in present-day Lithuania or present-day Czech Republic, if you were really looking at where they're at. Stalag, by the way, I think many of you are aware of this, is really just an acronym for the German Stammlager, which you could translate perhaps as base camp or main camp. They're often sub-camps of these, and then you see the Roman numerals. That has to do with the German Armed Forces defense districts around the country. So a Stalag 9 or a Stalag 4 lets you know what district you're in, and sometimes there are A, B, C, D, etc. camps in each of these districts. So I wanted just to get that out of the way. And I'll say something here about Angelo Spinelli in a second. Just wanting to show the human side of this about being a prisoner of war. There had been American prisoners of war in this system since at least the second half of 1942. Those were primarily airmen, most of those shot down over Western Europe and then brought into this system. And the first real infusion, big numbers that come in, is 1943, Kasserine Pass. And then with the air war, especially American involvement, 8th Air Force in 1943, those numbers steadily grow. Angelo Spinelli is one of those individuals. He was a photographer of the U.S. Army who was captured at Kasserine Pass, ends up in Stalag 3B and Stalag 3A. It's a remarkable story. He was able to do a little bartering with one of the German guards, was able to obtain a camera, and he would move around, especially Stalag 3B. He would put the camera in his trousers, unzip, and just take photos left and right. And then he made deals with, in fact, German guards to develop the photos. We think about 300 or so of those actually survive. This volume here, Life Behind Barbed Wire, published a lot of these photos with Fordham University Press. And it's amazing, in fact, what he shows. I mean, he's showing the barracks. He's showing, in fact, a lot of the American prisoners who are involved in calisthenics, they're playing sports, they're playing cards, etc. And one of the things that his volume captures, I mean, he's in there very early, some 24 months in captivity, is that in this very early phase, that a lot of the American prisoners, what they remember of it is boredom. They remember feeling helpless in some ways about the fact they could no longer be with their buddies, they could no longer really participate in the war, but it's not onerous. They were generally treated fairly well according to the Geneva Conventions. The food wasn't great, but it was reliable. You know, in terms of having blankets, you know, in terms of having footwear, etc. So relations with the guards, you don't want to romanticize it, but often were not that difficult. And they were very well aware from early on that the way they were treated, if there was a Soviet compound there or a place that held people from Poland or Yugoslavia, was starkly different. And Spinelli, in fact, and this would have got him into serious trouble, took images, in fact, of some Soviet prisoners who were executed there and was able to smuggle those out. So what I want to kind of note here, though, is that this notion about the Geneva Conventions, a fairly stable, not the most pleasant environment perhaps, but human at some level, this really does begin to break down in 1944, and it certainly will break down after the Battle of the Bulge. I want to note here very quickly a couple of instances of this. Most of the American prisoners you look at, if you look at their memoirs, if you look at oral histories, they will talk about the fact that later, after the war, they really start getting a full sense about this parallel universe, this SS run, about the concentration camp system. Many of them, of course, at the end of the war, see all the footage that we're familiar with, the photos and the newsreels about the liberation of the camps. But there are some cases of American POWs who find out firsthand what this system is like. These are two examples, L.C. Beck Jr. and Joseph Moser, both airmen shot down over France, June 1944, and then late July or August 1944 from Moser. They're actually rescued by members of the French resistance, and it's a stunning story. What had ended up happening is that these groups had been infiltrated by informers. Still not clear, in fact, who they were, a man and a woman, and they're taken to Paris and promised that they're going to be taken to Allied lines. Again, this is after D-Day, the summer of 1944. And then sometimes one by one, in some cases, and maybe 3 or 4 of them, they're brought to Paris and they're turned over to the Germans. Not the Luftwaffe, not the Army. They're turned over to the Gestapo. And what many of these men recall is being dragged out of the cars and being beaten. And then they're actually held in a prison at Frayne that the Gestapo used for French resistance fighters. And then as the Allies are nearing on August 15th, 168 of them, Allied, airmen, they're not just Americans, people from Britain, from Canada, from New Zealand that are there. They're put on a train, and they believe, in fact, they're going to be taken to a Stalag Luft camp, a camp maintained by the German Air Force for airmen, POWs. It's a several-day journey in August, and they begin to get something like the experience of what Jews and others had gone through. They travel across Germany, and where do they arrive at? It is not a Stalag Luft, it's Buchenwald concentration camp. And when they're taken off the train, they're greeted by black uniformed SS men. And all of them, when you see them talk about this experience, what they never forget, because they're expecting to see Luftwaffe personnel, is they get there and these SS men relish it, right? You see the chimney right there? That is the only way you're ever getting out of here. So what saves these 168 Allied airmen, in fact, is an American air raid nearby in Buchenwald. There's a Luftwaffe team that investigates in the fall of 1944, and while they're there, these airmen realize these are Luftwaffe, and they are able to contact them and say, we should not be here. We are airmen. We should be under your custody. And so almost all of them except 2 are taken by the Luftwaffe. There's a team that comes back a few days later, and they tell the SS, quite extraordinary, these are our men and we're taking them. Unfortunately, L.C. Beck had contracted pneumonia, one of these endless SS roll calls that they would subject inmates to, and he perished in that camp, we think, in late October of 1944. He left an extraordinary journal behind that was published by his parents right after the war, where he talked about, in fact, being taken very good care of by the French resistance before the Informer was involved. Moser will be transferred to Stalag Luft 3 and eventually to Stalag 7A. I'll come back to that later. And he survives and lives to be 94 years old, died in the last decade. So, talking about the last 6 months of the war, you have to really deal with how, from December 1944 forward, the German Stalag system, this POW system that had been fairly stable for several years, really goes into deep crisis. And it goes into crisis for reasons I think we can all appreciate, which is that the Germans, in that last phase, first they get a big infusion of American prisoners from the Battle of the Bulge, just tying in things we've been talking about the last couple of days. Anywhere from 20 to 25,000 are funneled into this system, and they're funneled into this system right at a moment where the Americans, of course, will turn the tide against the Germans at the Bulge, regain the initiative late January, early February 1944, and the Soviets hit them with a Vistula-Oder offensive in mid-January. So they're now pushing deep into German territory, and the Germans themselves finding increasingly difficult to just feed their own personnel at these camps, much less the prisoners that are there. One of the men who comes in, not part of the Battle of the Bulge, but is Colonel Hubert Hub Zemke, pictured right here. He's shot down. His P-51 comes down in late October 1944. He's taken prisoner and is sent to Stalag Luft 1 at Bart. It's up on the Baltic. The American inmates there love to talk about beautiful Bart on the Baltic, how they refer to it. And Zemke himself, I highly recommend his memoir, Zemke's Stalag, I have referenced here. Zemke, in fact, talked about how relieved he was just to make it to the camp. Because along the way, in a train that's attacked by, almost certainly by American fighters, he mentions, in fact, there was a woman who was in that attack, practically decapitated, who fell on top of him. And once the train kind of ground to a halt, he helped with the wounded, but there were German civilians nearby who saw him and wanted to take revenge on him. And Zemke mentions the only thing that saved his life was a Wehrmacht lieutenant who pulled a pistol and told the crowd to move back. So he's one of those, in fact, that was just thrilled to make it to this POW camp and be under the control of the German Air Force. Once he's there, he will note, in fact, Zemke, he's of German descent. He knows German. He also has a little Russian. He can communicate very well with the commandant, and he realizes how things are deteriorating in the camp. And the fact that many of the guards there, because they're guarding airmen, are increasingly just enraged about having to monitor these airmen, especially as so many Germans have been killed in the air war. And Joseph Goebbels' just incessant propaganda about airmen as terrorists. And he also notes that his own men, just talking to the Americans, would enjoy walking up to the German guards and just shouting, "Come on, Joe, come on, Joe," Joe being Joseph Stalin, taunting the Germans that the Soviets were getting closer every day. And then, in fact, in February, the camp administration at Stalag Luft 1 begins to, just to feed their own personnel, confiscate Red Cross parcels earmarked for prisoners. So February into April 1945 is a very dark time at Stalag Luft 1. More about that later. Now, we're now in kind of late January, early February 1945, and I mentioned the Soviet offensive. Stalag 3C, using it as another case, is a camp about 50 miles east of Berlin. And it's actually famous, if you're thinking of the American context, of Sergeant Joseph Burley, picture here in this newspaper ad, who had escaped from 3C earlier in January 1945 and managed to make it to Soviet positions. This is quite famous, in fact, because he joins an armored unit and is really amazed to see women not only in tanks, but in command roles with the Red Army. But what I want you to be aware of is what happens after this, is that as the Soviets are pushing towards the Oder River, again, you're talking 50 miles east of Berlin here, the Germans are deciding they have to evacuate this camp. And there's some 2,000 Americans in the camp, and we know, in fact, from a lot of personnel files of these inmates that the Americans really delay evacuating the camp until January 31st. The delays are over, and the Germans begin to march them out in columns of 500. And the Germans have kind of lost track of how close the Soviets are. These inmates are wearing a kind of hodgepodge of uniforms. Again, the Germans having problems just keeping food, about keeping blankets, about keeping footwear and coats for these inmates. They're wearing really whatever they have, and a Soviet spearhead surprises them. And when the Soviets show up, they've really only gone a few hundred yards out of the camp. The Soviets see these columns and think, we've just come upon a German unit. So they open fire on the head of the column. And then absolute pandemonium ensued. The people at the front of the column, and here I'm just talking about the Americans in this evacuation, they make it to the Soviet positions and they say, oh, we're Americans, we're Americans. And the Soviets take them in, and the group at the back, still closest to the camp itself, the Germans keep control of them, and there's this terrible situation where people in the middle flee into a nearby field, are pinned down, and caught in a crossfire as the Germans begin to return fire. This is an awful situation. We know there are men from the 82nd Airborne, from the 30th Infantry Division, and the 442nd Regimental Combat Team among these inmates. 22 of them, at least, we think are killed, and some 50 wounded. The Germans will counterattack the next day and push the Soviets back, and it's just absolutely vicious fighting in this area until March. I mean, the whole area is just destroyed, especially by Soviet artillery. And these Americans that were fortunate enough to make it to Soviet positions, they go through an extraordinary journey, eventually going out through Odessa and Ukraine before their return to Allied positions. I'm running out of time here, ladies and gentlemen, so I just thought I would also note here a couple of, very quickly, some fairly famous cases. Stalag 11B in eastern Germany. It was noted as one of the harsher camps within the German system, overall known for the Geneva Conventions following those. But this camp, especially very late in the war, becomes an increasingly draconian place. They separate Jewish American prisoners, many of them taken in the Bulge. And then these prisoners, in fact, in mid-February are turned over to the SS, where many of them are sent to Berge, originally a sub-camp of Buchenwald, and where they're actually digging tunnels for a synthetic oil facility there. And then as the Americans, Third Army, are getting closer to this whole area, the SS will evacuate them. And speaking of these Americans, these service members finding out more and more the experience of what Jews and political victims had gone through, they're marched, a kind of death march, and maybe up to 300 of them evacuated, forced to march in early April. 73 of them perish. This is early April of 1945, an image of some of these inmates at Berge, and they just tell these amazing stories about how the foreman would often beat them with shovels or rubber hoses if they even took a minute off from work in these tunnels. Right here at the end, just to show you a few images about liberation, not wanting this to be forgotten. Stalag 11B, that's Fallingbostel, that's in northwestern Germany, liberated by the British. You have Americans there on the left, along with British and Canadian inmates in the Fischbach POW camp there on the right. And I thought I would conclude by showing Stalag Luft 1, liberated by the Soviets in late April, early May of 1945. Zemke reaches a deal with the commandant, where the commandant agrees to first not only evacuate the camp, to march the inmates, but second, he will essentially turn it over to Zimke as the Soviets arrive. These are images taken from the liberation. You actually see an American on horseback wearing an armband. Zimke kind of improvises an MP force and finds it very difficult to maintain control over his men, because when the Soviets show up, there's a Soviet officer who says, "I want all this barbed wire torn down." And so the inmates are eager to play along, and so it's torn down, and there's really chaos there for a number of days. But Zimke reasserts control, and eventually, working with the Soviets, arranges an airlift to get these men back to American positions. I thought I would close with a positive story, since there's so much grimness in here, ladies and gentlemen, but I really encourage you, if you have a chance, look at Alexander Jefferson's oral history done with the museum. He was at Stalag 7A, had been in Stalag Luft 3 of the famed Great Escape, and was among over 100,000 inmates in that camp and its subcamps liberated. And he talked about how happy he was when he saw the 14th Armored Division on April 29th, 1945, and the amazing biscuits and gravy and steak the Americans provided when they set up a field kitchen there for all of these inmates who were on the edge of starvation. And as somebody who loves biscuits and gravy, I find that story especially endearing. Thank you very much for your time.
Okay, we got two very different approaches to telling the POW story. Rich Frank gave us the statistics. Jason gave us a lot of personal stories. I think they're both good to get this history uncovered. So, ladies and gentlemen, you know the routine. I'm going to ask them a couple of questions, and then we're going to turn to the audience. So, Rich, you have the picture of the Bataan prisoners, and I think American authorities had a good idea of the atrocities that happened to the Bataan prisoners. How was the story then handled with the American public? Do you tell the public or you don't?
Right. Well, actually, there was a void for quite some time after April, May 1942, where we didn't really know exactly what had happened. There were some little pieces of evidence, but nothing that was really full and compelling. In 1943, however, 3 American officers escaped from a POW camp on Mindanao, and through a long chain of events, they eventually managed not only to survive, they were picked up by an American submarine and taken to Australia. General MacArthur was very insistent that anyone who came out of the Philippines, civilian, military, whatever their age, he would personally interrogate them. So these 3 individuals, particularly a fellow named William Diess, who was an Army Air Force officer, who had the most graphic account of the Bataan Death March, really, that was the crystallizing event to alert at least American leadership as to what had happened to American POWs. What then happened, however, was a real conundrum, which is that the message that they gave, particularly Diaz, was how horrific the conditions had been at the Bataan Death March, how really difficult was the life of POWs, how many had died shortly after the Bataan Death March, how many were starving in Japanese captivity. That was one part of the story. But the other part of the story was that the one thin barrier between extinction and life for most of the POWs was that occasionally the Japanese would let through these Red Cross packages. So when this two-sided story was being told to policymakers, the question that immediately came to mind on the American side was, well, if we publicized what the Japanese had been doing, will they retaliate by cutting off the Red Cross packages? Well, about the same time, both the Australians and the British had also had escapees who had given them some indication of what was going on with respect to these camps. And both the Australians and the British were quite insistent that the story should be publicized. And this conversation went on into the fall of 1943. And finally, basically, there was a fiat issued by the British and the Australians that they were going to go ahead and publish regardless. And then the Americans capitulated on publication, and there was a joint agreement that in January of 44, then the story was going to be, and it was released both in the U.S. and of course, this was something that to reinforce in the views of the American public just exactly how diabolical the Japanese Imperial Armed Forces were, and of course it had consequences throughout the rest of the war and into the post-war period. But I have always thought, how thankful I think most of us would feel like we were not in a position to make that decision when you know that on the one hand, you want to publicize this, on the other hand, it could be a death sentence for a lot of your countrymen in Japanese captivity.
Okay, finally a couple of questions for Jason. Jason, you make a big point about how the Germans treated Allied POWs before the final 6 months and during the final 6 months. And of course, we heard on Thursday, indeed, as you said, that thousands of POWs made it to German camps out of the Battle of the Bulge. So they all encountered very bad circumstances. So can you tell us a bit about why the circumstances deteriorated so badly?
Yes, and it's a really important question. Before doing that, I just want to briefly note, I mentioned Alexander Jefferson at the end. I want to note he was a Tuskegee Airman in the 332nd Fighter Group, so we're not wanting to neglect that. But about the last 6 months, so a couple of things that go back to Rob's keynote on Thursday night, I'd just like to reiterate, is he mentioned, in fact, the destruction of German infrastructure that was already well underway and then really just accelerates into early 1945. As the Allies are pushing onto German territory, they have total dominance over the skies in terms of the Germans being able to move anything by truck or train. It's extremely difficult. And so what you have, of course, then is a food crisis that's then compounded by two other factors. One, of course, Rob mentioned too, which is the historic winter of 1944-45, and then overcrowding as the Germans are moving POWs from one camp to another to keep control of them. And that just varied depending on where they were at, keeping them from the Americans or the British or from the Soviets. And so you have these big influxes of inmates into camps that are not prepared for them. They're simply not prepared. And I mentioned about Stalag 7A. They actually received like several thousand British prisoners and moved there, and the camp commandant is not even notified these men are on the way. So they have no preparations really to accommodate them. So you have all of this overcrowding, and what of course follows with that. Typhus and dysentery become major problems on top of what you would expect during winter, influenza, and pneumonia. So these have really become catastrophic conditions in many of these camps. And you have German personnel there that become increasingly desperate themselves. That's something a lot of the American prisoners always will talk about is not knowing what was going to happen to them, what would the Germans do. And it may not be something like just executing them, just the terror of being forced to evacuate in those kind of conditions in late winter was frightening enough. So these are things that they all have to face. So.
Yeah, thank you, Jason. So I think the situation is similar to what I said, namely that it also has to do with the fact that there is no medals to be won by officers for treatment of POWs. So I think the armed forces in all nations during World War II are just not prepared to deal with large numbers of POWs. I think that is sort of a given in the situation. But let me ask you another question, Jason. A few years ago, we had a couple Austrian researchers here who gave a talk, and they talked about the lynching of Allied airmen. This is where scholarship in Germany and Austria is going today. So in other words, Goebbels incites the German public to go after the airmen when they come down, calling him air gangsters. And so you have the situation where civilians start lynching Allied airmen. So can you enlarge on that a bit?
Yes, and that's definitely the area, my points about the stability of this system and in general regarding the Western Allies, the Germans honoring the Geneva Conventions. But 1944, you begin to see this changed for the worse. It's May of 1944 that Goebbels makes these remarks that you're talking about, referring to Allied airmen as terror flyers, as air gangsters. He essentially calls them murderers and terrorists and says that they should be denied the protection of the law. So if Germans want to take matters in their own hands, everyday Germans, i.e. civilians, that should be allowed to happen without fear of punishment. So that's there, and you're going to have many cases of Allied airmen who are shot down. There's a case up on the North Sea where their German civilians are involved targeting a crew of a B-17 crew. You also have cases in Germany and in Austria where you have airmen that are targeted, and everyday, if you will, everyday German civilians are involved, but often local Nazi party officials are involved. We can't blame the SS and Gestapo for everything. They have plenty of blood on their hands, but there are others involved in these atrocities as well. Hitler Youth, depending too on where they were at, but in many cases, if they caught these airmen, they were never turned over to the Luftwaffe. They were just lynched. And I think, Günter, as people, in fact, you helped foster a lot of this research, who claimed that well over 100 Allied airmen they had been able to document cases were lynched, including some Tuskegee airmen who were caught up in this kind of criminality. And it's no big surprise if you start looking at oral histories, memoirs from Allied airmen, they always say there were two things I was terrified from if I made it to the ground. One was German civilians, about being pitchforked and never turned over to police or military personnel. And of course, this will not surprise anybody in this room, if the SS or Gestapo got their hands on me before the Luftwaffe did, much less inclined to worry much about the Geneva Conventions.
Yeah, this happened particularly towards the end of the war as more and more civilians were bombed by the Allies. So in that sense, it was a reaction to that. But I think the 100 you mentioned were 100 Allied airmen who these people can document, these historians, in Austria and Hungary. So if you add Germany to it, you probably have hundreds of airmen who were lynched. So this is, I think, becoming towards the end of the war a serious problem. But ladies and gentlemen, we open the room up for your questions. We are very keen to hear from you.
Thank you,
So Jeremy.
panelists.
Thank you.
By the way, I think I forgot to mention at the beginning that Jeremy was promoted this year, and you've seen his new role, so we should all congratulate him, I think.
Hey.
Thank you, Dr. Bischof. First question is all the way in the back to your left.
Thank you. Thank you, gentlemen, for a very interesting presentation. The topic of the prisoners of war is something that interests me particularly, and I apologize if it's a bit redundant with your last question, Mr. Bischof. But, since yesterday, I'm thinking about the lecture about the bombing of Japan, and I was thinking about the crew of the B-29 that were going to bomb Japan, and the result of the complete destruction of cities. And I was thinking about, yes, indeed, a lot of B-17, B-24 crew members were murdered arriving, after having been shot down over Germany. Excuse me. I imagine that the crew of B-29 being shot down over Japan and bailing out, clearly they have zero chance of any survival if ever they reach the ground. I mean, they would be executed by civilians or by the Japanese. I mean, what would happen to the crew of the B-29 bombing Japan? Thank you.
Yeah, that's a good question. One thing about bombing Japan is that the Army Air Forces sustained a much lower rate of total aircraft losses and aircrew losses than in Europe, much, much lower. With respect, however, to how the downed airmen were treated, first of all, the American airmen were extraordinarily aware, thanks to the stories that had come out earlier, about the, shall we say, undesirability of being taken prisoner by the Japanese. So one aspect about that usually gets overlooked is that aircrew, if they had any ability to get their aircraft out over the sea, would normally attempt to do that and ride the plane down rather than bail out over Japan. And indirectly, I'm sure that caused a pretty fair number of fatalities during the air war over Japan. Secondly, we do know that the treatment of some of the airmen who were shot down was abysmal, as you would expect, and very much parallel to what happened to American airmen in Japan. One of the most best documented and tragic stories about this is Hap Halloran, who was shot down, and as he was treated like an animal to be shown in the zoo by the Japanese. During one of the Tokyo raids in May 1945, a fire broke out that closed in on a major Japanese prison in the Tokyo area. It had 62 American airmen, most of whom were B-29 crewmen who had been recently shot down, and about 200 Japanese military prisoners who were in there for various infractions. The guards of the prison, as the fire approached, opened the cells of the 200 Japanese prisoners, and they left all the Americans in the cells, and all 62 of them died in the fire that closed in on the prison. So that's kind of what is the mixed story that you get with that. I have to emphasize also when I mentioned those at least hundreds, I mean, no one really knows for sure exactly how many there were, but certainly substantial numbers of Allied aircrew, particularly American, because we tended to dominate in terms of the military might that was deployed against Japan. Those who were shot down and were captured by the Japanese, and all over the Japanese empire throughout the American campaigns, very large numbers of those airmen never survived captivity. A conspicuous example was we had a long-term effort against the Japanese base at Rabaul. We have good documentation about the number of Allied POWs, airmen who were shot down and taken prisoner, and the very large number of them who died in Japanese captivity at Rabaul.
Next question is with Connie, to your left.
Thank you. Do you know anything about any Allied merchant mariners that were captured by the Japanese? Were they treated as military or as slave laborers?
Overall, fortunately, there are about 9,300, at least this number I think is accurate. It's about 9,300 American merchant mariners died during World War II. The largest majority of them died as a result of enemy action. The number who were killed in theaters involving the Japanese is a little unclear, and it's a much smaller fraction of the total, particularly because the largest number of American merchant mariners who died in 1942 during the big U-boat campaigns off the American and Gulf coasts. We do have an incident involving one Liberty ship that was intercepted by a Japanese submarine in the Indian Ocean, and it was sunk, and there were my memory is about 70-some survivors, and the Japanese submarine surfaced and then proceeded to pick up the POWs, but then severely abused them and eventually tied them up and tossed them back into the water. Most of these, almost all these individuals died, some survived, but that submarine skipper, I believe he was the one who survived the war that was tried for that episode. There were a couple other episodes that were parallel to this, but not as severe in terms of total American deaths. But that's the sort of thing that when you were dealing with the Japanese, you became a prisoner. It was like a game of roulette where the odds are very steeply against you in terms of having your captivity recorded and your survival actually transpiring.
You're going to stay in the same area with Connie, please.
This is a follow-up to that. I knew a person named Cecil Doubleday, who's on the American President Lines, Harrison. He was, his ship was being followed December 8th by a Japanese cruiser, I believe. The captain ended up scuttling the ship when he found out about Pearl Harbor. This is December 8th, Japan time. He ended up in an internment camp with the rest of the crew members. The ship was under charter. I think they were picking up Marines in China. The question I have is he told me that because he was a merchant seaman serving as a messman, probably the lowest position on a ship, he said that the company was not compelled to owe him anything once he was no longer in the service of his ship. Because he was not in the military, the government was not paying, going to afford him anything once he was interned, and literally spent the entire war in a Japanese internment camp from till August 45. Some of the officers were, because they were reserves, Navy, they ended up going into POW camps. But I was wondering what benefits were provided to internees or POWs who were out of the military during the war.
Thank you. You mentioned, were you talking about the President Harrison? Correct. Yeah, okay. Which was a large merchant passenger ship, which was, as indicated, was captured by the Japanese immediately upon the commencement of hostilities. With respect to Americans who became prisoners of war, the Japanese, and the issue of compensation, if you were an American serviceman, you accrued pay and benefits during your POW captivity. The catch was that typically you were not promoted during your period of captivity, or when you were given a retroactive promotion, it was significantly less than you would have had you probably been in the armed forces throughout the entire period of captivity. So those people, which would include the Filipino scouts, who were American servicemen, they were not in the Philippine Army, they were American servicemen, they would have been entitled to pay and benefits of the period that they were held. Merchant mariners, it was not just being a merchant mariner and captured by the Japanese. The general rule with merchant mariners was you only got paid while you were serving at sea, right? If you're not serving at sea, you were not going to be paid. So the fact that the companies refused to pay you for POW time when you weren't working for the company, there was nothing different from that from what the ordinary, and the whole issue of recognition of merchant mariners, that would drag on for decades thereafter. And I can tell you from my personal experience dealing with U.S. Navy sailors, including the principal of my high school, they were not real keen about benefits for merchant mariners because the rate of pay that they were drawing was so much higher than the average sailor or whatever here. And I remember Mr. Baker had, shall we say, strong views on the subject, and particularly because his destroyer attempted to load ammunition before the Battle of Leyte Gulf. They tied up next to this merchant marine ship after work hours. And the merchant mariners wouldn't refuse to assist the sailors in loading ammunition. Mr. Baker never forgot or forgave that particular episode. With respect to American civilians, again, I went to law school, I was a lawyer. I can think like lawyers, which is not a meritorious thing to have on your record. Okay, the deal was the State Department took the position with respect to the war with Japan, as opposed to the war in Europe, which was that in November, December 1941, American citizens in the Far East were warned specifically that they needed to get the hell out before war broke out, okay? And this applied everywhere except in the Philippines. So if you were taken as an internee by the Japanese and you weren't in the Philippines, you were not entitled to diddly squat as far as the U.S. government's position was at that time. I think later they softened it up. But initially, it was a very hardline position. That, okay, Charlie, you were warned. You ignored our warning. We don't owe you a nickel or whatever here. And of course, the great majority of Americans who did become captives, internees of the Japanese, were in the Philippines. And let me just, while I'm on that, the great majority of these people were gathered at Santo Tomas in Manila. It had, offhand, I think it was over 4,000 internees there, including women and children and whatever. About 75% of them were American, and more than 20% of them were British. And they were held through the war. And as the food situation in the Philippines went downhill, they set up schools for the children. And the schools were on the top floor of some of the buildings. And by December 1944, they stopped the schools because the kids were so weak that they couldn't climb the steps up to the school area. And what this connects to is the fact that one of the aspects about the whole situation in the Philippines in World War II is that if you understand what happens in places like Indonesia, where like 2.4 million Indonesians would die of starvation, of about 70.5 million. In northern Vietnam, 1 million will die in 1945. Had we not gone back into the Philippines, and the Filipino people had been left to their own devices in the hands of the Japanese in 1945, we would have had horrendous numbers of deaths of Filipinos during World War II because we did not return.
Next question is going to be all the way in the back to your right, please.
Thank you. I enjoyed your presentation. My question is, American POWs could not sue for reparations against the Japanese. Is that correct? Is that
Yeah, the question is
under the Treaty of San Francisco?
Right.
Right.
The position of the Japanese government was and remained that at the Treaty of San Francisco, which basically was the terms under which the Japanese regained their sovereignty, included provisions which basically the Japanese could validly claim that we'd waived the rights to any basically reparations for anything that was done, and that remained the position of the Japanese thereafter. And of course, this was an extraordinarily contentious issue with respect to the American POWs who were held in such terrible conditions with the Japanese. And that went on literally for decades until the number of surviving now Japanese POWs is very small. And I certainly spent hours with people like that listening to their horrific stories and the fact that we had waved that away. And I think that was a great oversight by our State Department and legal individuals that they did not recognize that there was something there that there was unfinished business with respect to our relations to the Japanese with respect to that issue.
We're going to get one more question here.
Yeah, this better be for Jason, or I will hold
Who's
you
got a question for Jason?
One of the first prisoner groups, you mentioned Battle of the Bulge. One of the prisoners or one of the people had gotten shot through the jaw, and he got some aid from one of the German captives by bandages that he said were not much more than paper. Was that common that they would get any kind of treatment at all from their prisoner or from their captors, or is it your wounds, you die, it's one less mouth to feed?
Well, thanks, Rich, for advocating for me. That's a great question in that a lot of the prisoners, in fact, I looked at a lot of those files when I was working for DPAA, were from the 99th and 106th Infantry Divisions at the Bulge, taking those opening days. And there is, at the very beginning, so they're processed late December, early January of 1945, and there's already a lot of improvisation going on in terms of what the Germans are providing in terms of food and water and medical care and shelter. And you see that as weeks, just every week go by, get worse. So this story you're talking about with bandages, it doesn't surprise me. You see a lot of that in terms of just like having a uniform, if you're taken prisoner in December 44, is just pieced together often from different things. And it really is just kind of holding together what kind of duct tape sort of uniforms that they have. And it's totally improvised, and it obviously adds all of this deep terror for a lot of American prisoners that even if the Germans don't take action against us, we might just die from exposure to the elements, from disease, or from malnutrition. And that's, of course, what happens. The vast majority of that 1,100 I mentioned are from just December to May of 45.
Ladies and gentlemen, Günter Bischof, Rich Frank, and Jason Dawsey.
Thank you. Pleasure, as always.